Okay, so what is the difference between your ego and your shadow? What other parts of self exist? What is the purpose of all of these aspects of self? And how do we find balance and wholeness amongst them all? The purpose of this series of videos is to help you hopefully understand these aspects of self a little more so that you may feel a bit more comfortable to work with them and ultimately find ease and balance in that awareness that you develop. As with all things that we do through Embody Nadora, everything that I share here is about just offering you support and insight so that you can choose to do the work and implement all the pieces that you feel ready for. Um, Always with the onus of responsibility and accountability being on you. This is all yours. We are just simply here to offer our own teachings in a hope that it may enrich your journey in some way. So let's jump in. Okay, now this can be a pretty intense and maybe for some unbearable topic of conversation because it can bring up a lot of those uncomfortable emotions and those knee-jerk defensive thoughts. But as you will hopefully come to realize through this little series of videos, this is all by design. And so if this is you, if you feel uncomfortable, just try to grip onto one of these small aspects that you're ready and willing to work with and go from there, because any step in the right direction is a step in the right direction. If you don't know me, my name is Kylie and I am 1/3 of the Amazeballs team at Embody Nadora, where we offer coaching and mentoring services that encourage you to come home to who you are by embodying your truest self. Within the team, much of my focus and teaching center around the aspects of the mind, but from a very spiritual, multi-layered or quantum perspective. This subject of shadow versus ego is a psychological one at the core, but as with all things, there is always a lot more to it and a lot more at play. It's very multifaceted and multidimensional. From an analytical perspective, the shadow or shadow aspect can be thought of as the unconscious aspect of the personality that the conscious ego does not identify as being itself. Here you can find forgotten information and repressed memories, whereas the ego represents the conscious mind that makes up the thoughts and memories and emotions that we are aware of, that we put forward and that we show to the world. The ego is also responsible for our feelings of identity, connection, and security. Now, anytime you do any of this kind of work, it is multidimensional because it's multi-layered, multifaceted, it's quantum, it crosses those barriers. Ego and shadow work are both spiritual practices because it's about bringing a broader and higher point of view to the polarity aspects of ourselves. So when you start to look at the shadow, these hidden energies within you, all of those uncomfortable feelings and old emotional debts, the ego has to figure out what to do with all those things that it finds. So the shadow is not the ego, but the two are intimately connected. And as your ego, your outward sense of self is challenged by what you find when you choose to get to know your shadow, the two can put up a fight. Um, so the shadow consists of all the hidden and unconscious aspects, both good and bad, which the ego has either repressed or never recognized. So recognizing and including the shadow, therefore, is a threat to the entire ego aspect, because when we ultimately become self-responsible and self-accepting and becoming self-aware of the shadow, we no longer have anything to defend against and protect ourselves from. This is what it really means to be enlightened, to bring light from within self to the darkness within self, so that we ourselves see ourselves as we truly are. So let's take a quick look at each of the aspects of self, and then in the videos that follow this one, we can go into each in a little bit more detail. So the ego first, this represents how we want to be seen, how we project ourselves, and it's like a role or a character that we are playing or pretending to be. it can be an exaggeration of who we really are. It can be how we believe we should be or how others want or need us to be. And it can be an impersonation of someone who has the qualities we want to have. In any case, the ego is the aspect of self that shows up differently to who we are when no one is watching. It is our public self. And the purpose of this ego self is to soothe all the instinctual thoughts, feelings, emotions, and urges that would make us come across in any sort of negative way. But anyone with any awareness is always able to see through this mask and separate the real you from the role that you're playing. The ego is a thought-based quality of the conscious mind, and it analyzes on pattern and prediction. Sometimes a person can become completely lost within the ego to a point that there is almost no distinction between themselves and the character that they are playing or the world that they're living in. That world is not reality. It is just their version of a reality within which they have often given themselves a starring role. Those who are trapped here are usually overly concerned with what others think and will sacrifice themselves to please others, not out of the goodness of their heart always, but rather out of fear of not conforming and having to face a conflict that challenges their ego position. The shadow. The shadow aspect symbolizes what we have rejected about ourselves or are taught is wrong. The shadow is everything that we have denied in ourselves, or rather all the things that the ego has refused to associate with, but that we are still able to notice in other people, which is what can then become triggers for us. So things such as expressing our sexuality, being spontaneous or instinctual with our actions and feelings, feelings of aggression, fear, carelessness, passion, and love of material possessions. These are often things that we are taught are dark or dirty and sinful, and so we carry underlying feelings of guilt and shame. This is the aspect of self that will break down the defenses of the ego, because through accepting these shadows, we remove the idea that we have to be something other than what we are, that we accept that we are light and shade. And the shadow is this emotional nature and exists in opposition to the ego within the mind, but also separate from it. It is irrational and instinctive and therefore likely to project our own shadow qualities onto others. Carl Jung said, a man who is unconscious of himself acts in a blind, instinctive way and is in addition fooled by all the illusions that arise when he is everything that he is not conscious of in himself, coming to meet him from outside as projections upon his neighbor, which basically means that we see in others all the aspects that we deny within ourselves, and by observing these resentments with self-reflection, we have the opportunity to bring the shadow into consciousness, bring light to the darkness, become more seen and more whole. Then we have the masculine and feminine aspects of self. So within the shadow aspects of self exist both the masculine and the feminine aspects of expression. These aspects are created through the experiences we have with the mother and father roles in our lives. These experiences go on to form how balanced we are in the expression of our own masculine and feminine qualities. The masculine being the doing quality and the feminine forming the being or embodying aspect. Now, both are equally important. In every man, there is a woman, and in every woman, a man. Or to put it another way, within us all exists the image of the ideal man and woman. And if you like to connect the dots to the cosmos, like I do, you can acknowledge the ancient archetypes of like Eros and the Logos in the aspects of doing and being. In ancient Greek, Eros means love or life energy and is the first primordial energy of the female that is associated with receptivity and creativity and relationships and wholeness, whereas Logos, on the other hand, is the term for a principle of order and knowledge, and is the original male energy that is identified with power and thought and action. So as with the shadow, these archetypes have their own autonomy independent of the conscious mind. And so again, these qualities can be projected out to the world so that they appear like the qualities of a particular man or woman. Um, when these qualities find their balance within the shadow through love and essentially wisdom, a person can reconnect with a divine power within that will express itself as creativity and compassion for the natural world. These things that are always within us, but which we need to relearn or reawaken through the lessons we undertake by dealing with those of the opposite sex. So again, this brings more light to our inner world and shortens the shadow. The next aspect is the self or the soul self. Now, the self embraces ego consciousness, shadow, masculine, feminine aspects, and the collective unconscious into a complete embodied presence. Once the ego is soothed, the masculine feminine is merged and the shadow becomes integrated. The self can be considered in its wholeness, its completeness, and we can move more holistically into the next phase of depth and discovery. Simply put, the self is the combination of everything we are now, everything we have ever been, and everything that is within our whole potential to become. The self is who we truly are, and it is the symbol of the God within us. The moment the self is experienced, we begin to mature through a self realization and recognize that it is through being individual that we serve the greater oneness. And this is the beginning of the next phase of our journey where we consciously choose to seek that which is beyond self and to express our unique completeness within the collective mass unconsciousness in the form of creation. And so with that, I will leave this introductory video on the shadow ego self. As you can tell, there is a lot to dive into here and many aspects to cover. So maybe you want to take some time to reflect on anything you maybe uncovered here, or maybe you feel inspired to move right on with the next video because maybe you recognize an area that you are already ready to work with. In any case, thank you for watching. I hope to share in more of your journey back home to who you are.